Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder, and today we are going to discuss U.S. foreign policy in Latin America and Asia and how we begin to emerge from this time period as a global power. The learning targets today are to talk about the open door policy in China and the U.S. relations with Japan. We'll talk about what happens in Puerto Rico and Cuba after the Spanish-American War. We'll talk about Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy and Taft's dollar diplomacy, and we'll compare Wilson's moral diplomacy with his predecessors. So new markets in China means that China, everybody wants to go there and get the market share of things to sell to Chinese. Britain, France, Germany, and Russia carved China into what are called spheres of influence. And spheres of influence are areas of the country where within that sphere, that country has privileged access to its ports and markets. So we're going to carve up China. The U.S. is left out of this, and these spheres of influence avoid conflict with each of the industrialized nations, but the U.S. is left out. And so Secretary of State John Hay denounces the policy and demands equal access to trade in all areas of China. And during this time, some Chinese are getting upset with the influence of the West in their country, and they start the Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxer Rebellion is the secret society, the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, and this is formed in response to the foreign devils that are coming into their country. So in May of 1900, Boxers, as they're known, begin killing foreign missionaries or religious people going there to try to spread Christianity. And so a multinational force led by the United States of 20,000 troops quells the Boxer Rebellion, or puts it to an end. And then after this, the U.S. sends a note to the European powers affirming what we call the open door policy. And the open door policy says we don't want colonies in China. We want free trade all over the place, and that's how it should be. Okay, and the U.S. and Japanese tensions during this time, and we'll talk about those. Basically, Japan is becoming imperialist during this time, and they imperialize parts of Korea and China, but they take offense to Russian troops that are in Manchuria, which is the northern part of China. So they attack Russia. And they attack in February of 1904. They attack Russia's naval fleet in China, and they also invade Manchuria. And there are over 100,000 Russians casualties during this time. And this is the Russo-Japanese War. And so they fight back and forth. And in 1905, President Roosevelt holds talks between the leaders of Russia and Japan in New Hampshire. And he invites them there. They work out an agreement, and Roosevelt actually wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to end the Russo-Japanese War. Along the West Coast, we've already talked about discrimination, but anti-Asian sentiment is growing. In 1906, San Francisco bans Asian students from attending school with whites, and Japan is furious over this. Diplomatically, it was not good for the U.S. or Japan. And so Roosevelt understands the Japanese anger and negotiate what's called a gentleman's agreement, which is basically we agree that the school board will end its segregation policy, and Japan will agree to limit emigration of citizens to the United States. So they put a cap on how many people can leave their country and go to the United States. And then Roosevelt, in a show of our new military might, dispatches his Great White Fleet on a goodwill mission around the world to demonstrate our increased military power to Japan and other countries. And so the Great White Fleet, or this new fleet of 16 white battleships going around the world. Cuba and Puerto Rico, remember what's going to become of these colonies that we got from the Spanish-American War and the Treaty of Paris. Well, in Puerto Rico, Congress passes the Foraker Act in 1900, which establishes civil government in Puerto Rico. But still, there's legal questions about, are these Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens? I mean, what's going on? So multiple cases go before the Supreme Court to determine the rights of Puerto Ricans. And this is all of these cases can be lumped together in what are called the insular cases. And then in 1917, the Jones-Shafroth Act is signed by Wilson, and he gives Puerto Ricans more citizenship rights and more control over their own legislature. However, they still don't enjoy the same amount of rights as United States citizens. In Cuba, Congress passes the Teller Amendment when it declared war on Spain. And so what this meant is that if we do defeat Spain, the U.S. cannot annex Cuba and make it the new state of the Union. And so Congress also, later on, when we realize how valuable Cuba is as a colony, we make Cuba add the Platt Amendment to its new constitution as a new country, which it restricts the rights of Cubans and makes them what are called a protectorate of the United States. So they're not U.S. citizens and they're not a territory. They are less than a territory. They're a protectorate. We also negotiate land for use as U.S. naval bases there at Guantanamo Bay, which is still around today. Finally, let's get to the foreign policies of the progressive era presidents. Roosevelt is a proponent of big stick diplomacy. And he's a big fan of the old African saying, speak softly and carry a big stick. And he views the United States as special and has a moral responsibility to civilize weaker nations being nations that we feel we are better than. And so Roosevelt's foreign policy is called big stick diplomacy. We intimidate people with our military. If they don't do what we want, then we will use the military, but we're going to intimidate people with it. And we do this during the getting permission to build the Panama Canal. We cannot get permission from the country of Colombia to build in the canal zone through the Isthmus of Panama, which is a 48-mile wide strip connecting North and South America. It's only 48 miles wide. We need to dig through there to cut the amount of time that it takes for ships to get all around the Horn of South America. So we actually back a Panamanian rebellion, and we sit some warships off of Colombia's coast, and they can call for our help if needed. But Panama declares its independence from Colombia and then grants control to the U.S. over what's called the Canal Zone. Digging this canal, it's called the eighth wonder of the world because it's 48 miles long, pretty wide. They've widened it since the building of it because they needed to fit larger ships through there. 35,000 workers helped dig the canal, and over 5,000 die from tropical disease. It finally opens in 1914. The U.S. gives $10 million to Panama for letting us build it there, and a $250,000 annual rent until the end of the century, when we did finally turn control back over to Panama in the late 1900s. The Monroe Doctrine, if you remember that during like the first couple of weeks of school, we basically said that European powers stay out of the Western Hemisphere. But in the early 1900s, Latin America is having trouble paying their debts to other European nations. And so Roosevelt issues something called the Roosevelt Corollary. And the Roosevelt Corollary says that we will be in charge in the Western Hemisphere. We will be the police power, and we will also let other countries intervene. We won't let other countries intervene to collect their debts. And this reasserts America's long-standing policy of a European-free Western Hemisphere, which started with the Monroe Doctrine. Just a review of Taft's and Wilson's moral foreign policies. Taft's replaces dollars for bullets. So he wants to get people to do what we want with money, not military intimidation. And his foreign policy is called dollar diplomacy. And he increases American investments in Central American businesses to do this. And some could call it a success, but it really wasn't in place long enough for it to be successful or effective. Because then Wilson gets elected in 1912 and institutes moral diplomacy. Wilson is an anti-imperialist. He wants to be the first among equals for these countries. We want to work together. He does not want to seek any additional land or new territories or anything like that. He works to promote human rights, national integrity, and opportunity with these countries. And moral diplomacy does not necessarily mean he did not use force, because in 1915 he sends Marines to Haiti to protect American investments against potential German or French aggression there, because it was during World War I. And he basically forces Haiti to sign an agreement giving the U.S. more control over Haiti's financial and foreign affairs. And then he also sends military to intervene in the Dominican Republic and Mexico. In Mexico, there's a series of toppled governments that happen with American intervention. And so a guy by the name of Carranza assumes leadership in Mexico. And there is a group against Carranza. Anti-Carranza forces are organized by Francisco Pancho Villa. And they rise up. And we actually used to supply and be friends with Pancho Villa, be friendly to him. But in 1916, he raids a border town in New Mexico. So they cross the border, they raid the town, and they kill 18 Americans. So President Wilson dispatches John Pershing, General John Pershing, and 10,000 troops through the Mexican desert to hunt down and kill Villa. And they chase him for several months, but they do not capture him. He is killed later on by a rival gang. Wilson withdraws General Pershing and the troops due to concerns over World War I, so they can go fight in Europe. And at the end of all this, America has emerged as the next global power. And so World War I serves as the country's next great challenge. And so that is the end of topic 4. Be sure to write down any questions you have, and I will see you back